Welcome to the Fit Factor podcast, where we discuss health and fitness for those who may have mistakenly thought that their best, healthiest days were behind them. That's about to change. Welcome to the Fit Factor, ladies and gentlemen. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. In fact, it's going to be a lot different than all of my previous episodes. And I just wanted to give a little introduction to this particular episode because today, for the first time ever, I'm bringing on a guest. But I wouldn't just bring on any guest just for random conversation. I'm bringing on a lady by the name of Jodee Gibson, who's an NLP coach, NLP trainer. And we're going to talk about some things today that I personally, after 4 years of health coaching, have found to be probably the biggest issue that people struggle with. And that is the issue of emotional eating and food addictions. We're going to talk about some tools today that are very scientific and based on just kind of how the human body and the human brain is designed and how we're wired to function. So we're going to talk about some things today that I hope will help you or somebody you know. And if this particular episode does help you, or there are some things in here that you think, man, my friend or my family member, and somebody pops into your head, this person could really find value in this, I just want to encourage you to share it. So just wanted to kind of lay that out before we get started. We recorded this episode, obviously, in one conversation. On the podcast on Apple and Spotify, it's broken into part 1 and part 2. But on YouTube, I'm just going to let the whole thing run. It's going to be one streaming conversation. I don't want to interrupt any of it whatsoever. So before we get going, just want to let you know if there's anything that you hear in here that says, I could need some help with that, reach out to Jodee. If you're looking for help in your nutrition, if you're looking for some weight loss help, if you're looking for a coach, if you're looking for somebody that can help you go to the next level, or achieve some things that you've been struggling with and you just can't do by yourself, reach out to me. I'd love to connect with you. I'm at itfactorcoaching.health. I'm easy to find on social media, Instagram, itfactor_coach Redmond, Facebook, health coach Redmond. I'm easy to find, and I'd love to help you out and connect with you. So without any further ado, let's jump into this conversation with Jodee, and I hope you get some value out of this. Awesome. Well, gosh, I read your book during my 75 Hard. It was one of the books that I read, and it is, I'll show you right quick. I mean, it's kind of hard to see, but I mean, I have orange everywhere. It's like just notes and highlights, and it was so like mind-boggling for me. So the more as I read, there were specific places that kind of jumped out at me that I immediately as I was reading, I would say to myself, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I'm dealing with in the nutrition world. Oh my God, I have so many clients that this is the blueprint for how they function around food. I mean, I just found myself while reading the book, just thinking, oh my God, there's so many people that need to hear this, that need to know about the true cause of the things that they're struggling with. And I just thought, man, this has got to be a podcast, because my whole business, if you want to call it that, is built on helping people that are struggling with things that they don't even know why they're struggling with them. They don't even know the root cause. And I know we're going to get into some verbiage here about maps and things like that, that will enlighten people a little bit more about what you do. But yeah, when I was reading your book, I just thought that we have to have a podcast about this, because there's so much that you are teaching in your book that I feel like 99.9% of people on the planet are just completely oblivious to it. And if we can bring some awareness to it and educate some folks, I feel like that would be, in my mind, that would be a massive win, because I know there's a lot of people struggling with, especially in the food world, the things that I deal with as a health coach, nutrition coach. I just see it as being something we need to talk about. So without further ado, we're already recording, and I'm just going to take everything that we record and just, if we need to edit, we'll edit, but I don't want to miss anything. I don't want to miss one nugget of gold out of this.
Yeah, I feel like I was just going to share that, and I was saying in my brain when you were, kind of recapping the book inside, I was like, yes, yes, yes. Like, I'm so glad that you read it and that you get it. And I also am so glad that you decided to hit record, because I think oftentimes you and I will jam for a hot second and we're like, oh my God, I should have recorded that. Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's really smart just to hit go right from the beginning. So
Yeah.
I'm ready. Yeah.
So let's jump in, both both feet deep end, however you want to verbalize that. So let me just, for the sake of the podcast, let me just introduce you right quick. Uh, Today our guest is Jodee Gibson. Jodee and I met through an app called Clubhouse back during lockdown. And if you were one of the people that found Clubhouse during lockdown, you know that it had a phenomenal way of helping pass the time, because I could spend hours in there and listening to people speak, and occasionally getting on a stage and speaking myself, and finding different rooms with different topics. But somehow or another, I stumbled across this room that was about NLP. And I thought, what is NLP? I'm a curious kind of person. So I hopped in there, and Jodee was one of the people that was speaking that day. And I instantly was like, I need to know more. I have got to learn more about this. I could see the legitimacy of it. I could see the power of it. And Jodee and I reached out to Jodee through Instagram, and we connected through Instagram. And my wife and I had her on our previous podcast, The It Factor, and we talked about some NLP on there. But what I really want to do is just come into this, Jodee. I want to come into this like nobody listening to this heard any of the podcasts that we did before.
Yeah.
And let's just take it like it's a completely blank chalkboard and see where we go with it. But Jodee is an NLP coach, and she's going to explain a little bit about what NLP is, and we're going to talk about some of the details. But I'm telling you right now, there's some things that I want to hit on today in her book, Healing Your Map, that you can find on Amazon. If you're watching the video, I'll just hold that up for you right now. Healing Your Map. And Jodee, I've sent a bunch of people to Amazon. I don't know how many of them have bought the book, but I have been telling everybody that even remotely inquires about this book and what I'm reading, I'm like, go get it. You just got to go get it. But her
Yes.
book, Healing Your Map, is just, it blew my mind. I read it about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I completed it. And she's an NLP coach, like I said. And so, Jodee, let's just start right there with explaining to people what is NLP.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. And thank you for having me on. Like, I truly appreciate this. And I often share, like, I will stand on any stage or jump on any podcast to not only share my content, but to share these concepts that I think people are not talking about. And these are the concepts that have the capacity to completely transform your life. It's not like there's one major thing that you're doing wrong. It's not that there's one answer. It's that there's this concept that we all operate in patterns. We all have these behavioral patterns, linguistic patterns, emotional patterns. We're all just running in these highly unconscious patterns. And until we find ourselves in the pattern, or we find the root of the pattern, we're going to keep running them. And so, to answer your question really quickly, and I feel like I always skim over the top and we can go deep later if we need that, but NLP is neuro linguistic programming. And so, for anybody that's not fluent in that space, I'm going to break down each word because I think it's just easier that way. So, N standing for neuro. Oftentimes, when we say neuro, people think brain, but I want you to imagine that there's billions of neurons throughout your entire body. And the way that our neurons come alive or the way they were programmed was through the world around us. And we take content in through our five senses, right? And so imagine we have these five senses. In the world of NLP, we call them representational systems. And I made an acronym in the book called KVOG, like KAVOG, which is kinesthetic, auditory, visual, olfactory, and gustatory, which also kinesthetic is to feel, auditory is to hear, visual is to see, olfactory is to smell, and gustatory is to taste. And I share that in saying we take the world in through, like, our neurology has been programmed to those five senses. Some people might fight for a sixth, that's our intuition, which we can jam about later, but understanding that we had access to these five senses and these five rep systems long before we had access to words. And even now, present day, there's things that we have embodied, right? Meaning it lives in our body and we don't know why. There's things that we've embodied over time that we don't have context for. We don't have words for. It might be a way that we feel. It might be every time we see this one thing, we have the same reaction. It might be every time we hear that song or that tone of voice, whatever it is, right? We have this embodied response. And so the N in neurolinguistic programming is about that. It's about how our neurology has been programmed to take the world in around us. The second part is linguistics, right? We think about linguistics are spoken word, or linguistics means language. However, for anybody that's studied human communication or any of these spaces, I'm sure you know that only 9% of communication is verbal, right? So where does the rest of it go? So linguistics is understanding that even though anybody that's listening to this podcast right now would agree that we are speaking English, because English is a universally recognized language, the thing that we don't have is universal meaning for the words inside the English language. And so that's where linguistics falls, is inside the subjective experience of what I'm making these words mean. Also, what happens in my neurology? How has my neurology been programmed, right? So words trigger our neurology. So I can share with you right now, there's a really cute furry thing at my feet, right? My dog. And if I said to him, hey, buddy, you know what? I can't take you for a WALK right now because I'm on this really cool podcast with my friend.
Yeah.
He's not going to hear any other word but WALK,
Yeah.
right?
I know. I love the way you spelled that because my dogs are the same way. You can't say it.
Right.
You can't say WALK and you can't say FOOD.
No, or TREAT, all the things, right? That's why
treat.
parents, yeah, this is why when our kids were little, we would say, hey, to the other spouse or to a friend, hey, you want to take them to the PARK, right? Or we talk about CANDY, all the things, right? We started spelling things because once somebody's neurology is engaged, it's really hard to then bring their cognition in. It's really hard to then make them be logical when they're having this physiological response, right? And so the linguistics part is understanding how we have programmed language into our neurology and what meanings we give to that. And I share another little piece is, I'm sure oftentimes because you're a coach, you'll be in a session and you're talking to somebody and all of a sudden their voice changes, their cadence, their flow, their pace, their energy, right? All these things change and shift dependent upon what's going on in our physiology. So if you said to somebody, hey, how are you? And they were like, I'm fine. Immediately you would be like, wait, their audio doesn't match their video. Like they're saying they're fine, but the tonation, their energy, their posture isn't saying they're fine, right? And so it's understanding, oftentimes our physiology is telling a bigger story than the words that we're consciously using. So that's the N and the L. And then the P is programming, right? Neurolinguistic programming. And I share this in a candid way and often say, I had the luxury of being trained for the past 12 years by Dr. Richard Bandler. He's a co-creator of NLP. And he even shares candidly and says, listen, when we were creating this in the late 70s, early 80s, that's when they were building computers and the word programming was really cool. Now it's not really cool. People don't want to be programmed. And so I often say, like, if you can imagine like substituting that word for patterning. So imagine that it's neurolinguistic patterning. So if you can just imagine, it goes back to what I opened with in sharing, we all operate in patterns. And because our brain is constantly seeking efficiency, we have aligned our neurology to do the same. So we operate in patterns, whether they're what I was mentioning earlier, behavioral patterns, emotional patterns, linguistic patterns, physical patterns, whatever they are. As soon as we get a little tiny cue of one of those five senses, right? One of these KVOG things sets us off, we shift into a pattern. And so neurolinguistic programming is just simply about understanding what is the pattern that you're unconsciously operating in, and how do we find the root source of when that pattern was built? Because odds are high it was probably built before you were 4, maybe before you were 10. but you're now running it as a grown-up, wondering why you can't get a grown-up response from this completely normalized childhood pattern. So in a nutshell, and I know that was a long answer, but in a nutshell, really, I think I do the bigger definition because it lends itself to us later than to keep weaving it in. Make sense?
Okay. Yes, it makes 100% sense. And you finished that perfectly for us to go to the next phase that I wanted to take people through. Because, so let me, you guys got to give me a little bit of a leash today, because Jody, you don't know this, but you're the first person I've ever interviewed for my Fit Factor podcast. My
Oh
Fit
my,
Factor podcast is not an interview format show. My
wow.
podcast is me sharing information and content, trying to add value and to help people in their health and fitness. I don't have guests. So even the concept of us talking to each other right now is totally new for this podcast. But what you do and what we're going to dive into today, I felt like if there was ever a time for me to bring a guest into this format, this is it. Because what you just said sets us up for the next thing that I want to, the next phase. So you talked about the patterning, and you
Mhm.
talked about us responding emotionally to things that we don't even know why we're responding to them, that could have happened to us when we were 2, 3, 4 years old, or 6, 8, 10 years old. But there's things that we have experienced through those five senses in our past that we may be completely oblivious to, but they have programmed the way that we respond in those exact same situations, simply because our subconscious mind has recorded that event and said, okay, this is how we do this. And it just does the same thing every time.
Yeah.
Am I right there, or am I
You're 100% right.
okay?
100%.
Okay. So before we can go to the next step of where this is going to apply in the world of health and nutrition and dieting and weight loss and all the things that I like helping people with, describe to us what you referred to early in the book. One of the very first things you discuss is maps. So
Yeah.
you've already kind of set the stage for things happen to us throughout our lifetime that program us, and that's what the map's about. But describe what a map is to the average person that's never heard of any of this before.
Absolutely. And thank you for letting me jam on it. And I'm honored to be the only guest that's ever been here.
Yeah,
Thank you. I feel like it's validating for me and my work. And I love that you're bringing this to the people that believe in you. So just really quickly, the book is called Healing Your Map. And the concept is, I believe at the moment that we are conceived, we're given a blank map. And I say conceived because there's tons of research out now that shows that anything that happens in utero can impact your daily life.
I'm glad you
So at the
said that.
moment,
That's good.
yeah, absolutely. Because it's not about when we're born. We could have had abuse or crazy things happen when we were in utero, and we're like, but that never happened in my life. And it's like, yeah, but it didn't have to happen when you were on this planet.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah, I'm with
so
you.
sharing too, yeah. So imagine that at the moment that you are conceived, you're given a blank map. So you have a map, I have a map, our kids have maps, our spouses, our neighbors, our parents, our siblings, our coworkers. Every single person on the planet has their very own map. And your map then collects every single life experience you've ever had. So every sound, every color, every flavor, every relationship, every success, every failure, every heartbreak, everything you've ever experienced is on your map. And your map then becomes the lens through which you filter the world, right? Which is why you and I can witness something happen and I can say, that's not what happened, because I'm filtering it through my life experience and you're filtering it through yours. So we might be sitting at lunch and I'm like, man, why is that music so loud? Like, oh my gosh, it's so, and you're like, what? Like, it's not even phasing you. And what we don't realize is maybe I'm an only child who came from a really quiet environment. Absolutely not true, but just sharing, right? And you might be one of 10 kids and you're used to chaos and loud noises, and you have this complete ability to tune it out. And so, whatever our map is, like, imagine your map is your filter. This is the lens through which you see the world. And so, I think about right now, and not to get crazy, but just to share, there's lots of stuff people are fighting about. They're fighting about politics, I think we're done fighting about vaccinations. They're fighting about race, right? Like people are fighting about all these things, and it's all just dependent upon what's on their map. Like what makes you so passionate about something is the historical map you're viewing it through. And so it's about, the map is about understanding two things. I think if when I thought of the idea for the book, the idea is if I can dissociate and say, hey, what's happening on my map that's creating this outcome? So if I'm like, man, this guy makes me so mad, where it's like, no, what previously occurred on my map that's running his content through and creating this outcome for me? Because he doesn't make other people mad, he just makes me mad. Well, it means that there's something on my map that's blurring my view. And so if I can look at it and say it's the map, it's a lot easier to heal and to figure it out and dismantle it than for me to say, what's wrong with me? Like, why does he make me mad? Right. And so it's the dissociation allows you to say, okay, hey, there's this independent thing that's running interference. And the other concept is understanding like, this is what we're using to navigate around the world. And until we heal this, it's going to keep taking us to the same place. We're going to keep having the same emotional response until we understand how we learned that emotion. And so that's really the concept of healing your map, is the idea of, I think right now, and this is me being gentle, but I know they're working on it, but it's pushing it to the limits. But I feel like right now our Western approach to behavioral medicine is to medicate it. Okay, let's just diagnose them and medicate them. Oh, you know what this
100%.
is? You have anxiety, here's a pill. Or you
Yeah.
have depression, here's a pill. And that's no judgment. That's not about judgment for people. But if I were one of those people, my first question would be like, hang on a second, how did I get here? I wasn't born with anxiety. Anxiety is a learned behavior. It's a trauma response. ADD, ADHD, depression, anxiety, addictions, all of these, narcissism, all these things are trauma responses because something happened really early and I had to organize my map in a survival mode to stay safe. And now I'm still running this disorganized or dysregulated pattern, dysfunctional pattern, because I'm like, what do you mean? This is who I am. Why would I do anything different? I don't realize it's not that there's something wrong. It's that my pattern is disrupted. And so I think understanding that's really the concept of the map is until we heal our map, we're going to keep experiencing the same thing and landing in the same places.
You just mentioned the word trauma. I think one of the things that I misunderstood or maybe just had the wrong concept of prior to reading your book, trauma was always a like all caps, exclamation point, big
Yeah.
word. And as I read your book, I started to realize, holy cow, trauma doesn't have to be even really all that consciously memorable. It can literally be a very, what we would kind of interpret as a simple, insignificant incident. But explain what you mean when you talk about trauma, because there's a lot of people out there that say, "Oh, I was traumatized when I was a kid because this happened." And I mean, these big events that when they explain them to you, you think, "Oh my God, no wonder. Yeah, that's traumatic." But
Sure.
trauma can have a massive scale of degrees of severity to them. So I want you to just talk about that a little bit because this all plays a part in where we're going. So people stick with me.
Absolutely.
Stick with me. We're going
Yeah.
somewhere with this. This is going to
I was
radically
going to
change
share
some of your
too.
lives.
Yeah, and I didn't want to jump off the cliff there, but I'm like, because I'm ready to dive in there. But my trauma is not what happened to you, right? I'm borrowing this definition from one of my favorite trauma experts, who is Gabor Mate, who often says trauma isn't what happened to you. Trauma is what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. So trauma is that continual self-talk, disconnection, disassociated, detached energy that happens within us that we perpetuate because we don't know any better. And I share that in saying, say that you were the sibling that was always left out. And one of your parents was like, it's okay, come over here. I'll give you some graham crackers and I know the big kids are riding their bikes, but just come over here and we'll just eat goldfish or go, like,
Oh,
think
you
about
just
little
you
kids,
went there. Okay. I love it. I can
right?
see where yes, yes.
Or vice versa, it was never addressed, and it was just like, go to your room, or you're standing on the front porch and all the kids just took off on their bikes, but either you don't have a bike, or you're too little to ride a bike, or you don't know how to ride a bike, who knows, right? You got left out, and you just house it. And now as an adult, every time you're in a scenario where you feel left out, you grab a drink, you grab a snack, you grab a cigarette, you go gamble, you go shop, you go whatever, you that's a vice. And it's just about this connection. You were seeking connection, and at some level you got disconnected from yourself. And so that disconnection is what we're always trying to fill the gap with something.
Yep.
And so trauma really is what happens in that space.
So I'm glad you used that example. I don't know if you did that intentionally to set us up for where we need to go, but the graham crackers and the goldfish, and you could have said any food. You could have said
Sure.
cake. You could have said go get some ice cream. You could have used any food, but you just talked about how that food was used as a device to help you cope with the pain and the disappointment of being left out. And so
Yeah.
that's a powerful little nugget to throw in right now, because this is kind of where we're going. Um, this all plays into the diet world and the emotional eating that people struggle with. And so you just mentioned something. I've got some notes here, and you just kind of set me up perfectly to dive into where my notes actually start. So far I've just been jamming off memory, but you
Yeah.
just kind of set me up to start with where I've got some notes written here. So the goldfish and the graham crackers on page 35, and you use the word vice. All right. And you said
Yeah.
gambling, smoking, drink, whatever it is. There's a place in your book, page 35. It says this: if you were born into a family of addicts, the odds are high that you have unhealthy coping skills.
Yeah.
Your vice of choice replaces your ability to cope and self regulate. Your vice fills the gap where coping skills should exist.
Yeah.
So, since we're in the fit factor and we're talking about food and dieting and all the things that I deal with as a health coach, no better place to talk about this than here. The vice that so many people that I work with, their vice, not of choice, but it goes back to the childhood thing. They were given graham crackers at age 4 to help them cope. Their neurology, their five senses, the all the things you talked about earlier with what NLP is about, they were wired and programmed years and years and years ago to cope with their disappointment and their emotions with food. And now at age 30, 40, 50, 60 years old, they don't know anything different than what they were taught way back when they were kids.
Yeah.
And so
Absolutely.
this segment right here about vices and with food, just kind of talk about that a little bit, because this is where the
Yeah.
meat of this is coming in.
Thank you. I love that that page jumped out to you in that piece. I grabbed my book just to follow, and I'm like, no, I know exactly where you were in the book. The idea is twofold, right? Maybe more, but it's about understanding a couple of things. We lean into vices when we don't have the coping skill, which means that at an early age, trauma set in, right? And I share that too. Like, it doesn't have to be this big gigantic trauma. It can be the littlest tiniest things. And understanding that that trauma hit you so hard that your ability to follow on a progressive developmental scale or timeline, if you will, was interrupted. And so the expectation of you to use and utilize a coping skill, you may not have even been old enough to build one yet. And not to get off into left field, but you think about like the amygdala and the hippocampus and the development of them, and that they are seized in growth or in maturation, if you will, the earlier trauma hits. Which is why it's not that people don't know how to cope; it's that they never develop the skill to begin with. And that's something that I talk about in the book too. Is there's a lot of times we have this expectation either for ourselves, for our kids, for our spouses, for leaders, whoever it is, we have this expectation that they should do something. And the first question I always ask is, how certain are you that that skill is actually alive and well on their map? Like, if you want your kids to behave in a certain situation, is that skill present on their map, or are you just projecting your needs towards them? And so when we talk about coping mechanisms, and I'm saying if you were born into a family of addicts, if there's addictions already present, that means the coping skills are not present, which means coping skills were never a part of your map. And
Mm.
so if what you leaned into to cope or to soothe yourself as a very small child was something to eat or to nourish you or just to calm your system down, that's probably the pattern that you're still running today and doesn't stand out for you as a pattern because you're like, that's just who I am. That's just how we ate, or that's just what we do. Right. And think about too the multi-sensory experience that happens when people eat. So I was talking about K-Vog earlier. How many of these are set off when somebody grabs, whether it's something that's good for them and they just eat too much of it, or if it's something that's complete trash food, or they're just eating too much, right? They might be eating really healthy food, just twice as much as what they should eat, right? And so it's about saying what's happening in your physiology when you consume. Like, what is it soothing? Is it a feeling? Is it a taste? Is it a smell? But like, what is it that you're seeking? And the more conscious you become of, holy shit, that's why I do this. Or you go back to when is the first time, the very first time you can remember, and it might take some really, I don't want to say like deep meditation, but it might really take you getting still with yourself and trying to put your finger on it. And then you might go, I don't know, try it again, try it again. It would be practice, just like anything else, to really go back and try and get really curious around your map and say, where did this actually start for me?
Mm-hmm.
And odds are really high it started pre-verbal, or it started, I feel like everything happens. There's two sets of things. If it was pre-verbal, it was usually before the age of 4, because I know we can speak at 2, 3, 4 years old, but we're not articulating our feelings and getting really
Right.
deep into the intellectual concept of, right? But there's these two windows for me. There's pre-verbal before 4, and then there's the age between 4 and 10 that I think the majority of things happen. I think our map is completely built by the time that we're 10, and it's always, always, always editable. But I think that the first 10 years of our life really create that foundational lens that we filter with.
Well, you just said the map's editable, and that's where we're going to eventually go. I wrote down some things here towards the end of my notes here. I definitely want to go there. So you just hit on something without saying the word, and I just want to kind of point this out about and how important this is. And this doesn't even necessarily have to do with NLP, but talking about being born into families of addicts, I think it's a
Mhm.
really good thing to point out to people that are listening just how important your environment is when it comes to trying to make healthy choices in your life as an adult. Because as kids, we were forced into an environment that we had no choice about. And we learned what was there because we were just, I mean, we had no options. Now we have options. As adults, we can choose who we spend our time with. But I think that it's a really powerful example of how important environment is, because as a child, this is proving that the environment that we were in is what molded us and shaped us into becoming the people that we are today. So that's just kind of that the word environment just kind of popped into my mind when you were talking about families and addicts and being raised in certain conditions and situations and around certain people. Um, so still talking about this aspect of the trauma and the truth, just kind of
Sure.
sliding down through the book a little bit. So we now know that, and let's just take stress eating as an example. I hear so many people tell me I'm a stress eater. I'm a stress eater. Obviously, at some point in their map, somewhere on their map, there's an
Yeah.
event or events that have set them up to be that stress eater. And I love the way that you said to, if you'll stop yourself in those moments of doing the thing, being the stress eater, if you'll stop yourself in those moments and try to get quiet and ask yourself the question, when in my life did this become a thing? At what
Mhm.
point, what happened in my past that's causing me to eat because I'm stressed? Or what happened in my past that every time I get anxious, I want to eat? Or every time I feel depressed, I want to eat? And I mean, you can just go through the laundry list of negative emotions and things that we experience. But I think it's powerful to know that there's something in your past that is the root cause of that. And I think it's powerful to know, and we're going to get to the how. I think it's powerful to know that you can
Yeah.
change and edit your map and heal from those things that are causing you to stress eat and emotional eat and have food addictions. There's so many people that I coach that I sometimes, prior to reading this book, there's so many times with people I've been coaching in health that I've just wanted to throw my hands up and go, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help this person because they can't make it through the weekend without eating half the cake. They get
Yeah.
stressed, and next thing you know, they're 5 sleeves into Chips Ahoy. And I don't know
Right.
what to do. It's like trying to just hold back floodwaters, and I can't do it. And it's exciting for me, at least as a health coach, to read your book and know, gosh almighty, there is something that we can do to help people that are struggling with this. So that, as a
Yeah.
health coach, that gets me excited to know maybe there is something I can do. Maybe there's a direction I can send them to be able to actually fix the root problem. And that's probably the key, is we got to get to the root of this weed and kill that root.
Yes. Yes, and I love that you're mentioning root because I feel like I didn't jam about it in the beginning, but I'd love to circle back on it right now and to teach people like there's a root to everything. And so earlier when I was kind of beating up on the Western behavioral medicine crowd, what they're treating right now is symptoms, right? So for anybody that's listening that knows that what the DSM is, right? The DSM is this diagnostic statistic manual that any psychologist, psychiatrist, therapist, counselor, social worker, all these people have been trained in the DSM. The DSM truly is a book of symptoms. It's not a book of like what's in there is anxiety, depression, addictions, overeating, like all these what is it? Um, Oppositional defiant disorder, PTSD, like all these things that people get labeled with. And I'm like, those are all symptoms that have a root cause. We weren't born with these things. These were adaptations that we created in our physiology unknowingly. And over time, we ran them so many times, they built a pattern that now it's just become who we are. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's about, I feel like I'm always talking about let's find the root cause versus treating and medicating the symptoms, right? Sharing that saying like right now, the world of behavioral medicine would have you medicating your map. You can't medicate. You can medicate it, but for how long? Like I think that medication was created, and not to get off on a dissertation, I don't want to beat up on it, but I just want to create a fun point and circle it back. I think that medication was created to bring people to safety. So imagine that you're on a ship and somebody goes overboard, right? You throw the ring out, the life preserver out, you bring them back to safety. But now imagine if everybody was walking around the cruise ship with the ring still on them. No, you have to take the ring, you're safe, right?
Yeah.
Like you're safe, take the ring off. So walking around now still medicated years and years and years later, never having addressed what's perpetuating and creating that response is something that you can go to your practitioner and say, hang on, time out. Teach me how I keep building this pattern. Teach me how I keep having this response versus just medicating what shows up. And so I share that in saying, when we think about stress eating, we think about emotional eating, we think about all those things, right? The in the moment staying, like if you find you're like, oh my God, I'm stressed out, I'm gonna grab, I can tell you one of my go-tos is coffee. And I've really had to peel myself away from it lately because I was getting out of hand with it.
Hmm.
But it's understanding that the question becomes, what solution is this coffee gonna do for me? Or what solution is this bag of Doritos? My other go-to is chips and salsa, right? Like, what solution is this gonna solve for me? Nothing. It's just going to shut down these really big emotions I have right now.
Yeah.
Okay, how else can I shut them down? When did I learn these emotions? And this is what I'm leaning back into, that page 34. Odds are really high. I never even learned how to process or deal with these emotions. And so then if I have an expectation that I should be able to deal with this, or I should be able to handle stress, yet I never learned how. And now I'm just like, the loop over is to just medicate it, if you will. I'm medicating with food. I'm medicating with alcohol. I'm medicating with gambling. I'm medicating with dissociating. I'm medicating with procrastinating. Right? Like, these are all things that we um, resolve ourselves from having to deal. Right? We're like, well, I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm going to drink instead. I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm going to go smoke a cigarette. I'm
Yeah.
not going to deal, right? And we just choose. And so it's twofold. It's saying, what other, if I can't figure out yet, which I think it would be a really high expectation for us to try and figure it out by ourselves, how to process or how to deal, it might instead say, what else could I do in this moment that would at least leave me neutral or leave me feeling a little bit better than eating this whole bag of Doritos or whatever your vice is, right? And so it's like, okay, could I get up and go for a walk? Could I just dial a friend? Could I jump online and play a silly game? Could I do a crossword puzzle? Can I read a chapter in that book I've been wanting to, like, what else could I do? Can I grab my dog and pull him on my lap?
I
Can I go
really
find,
love, and I don't mean to cut you off, but
sure,
I love what you just said. We have a very foundational piece of my health program that we call Stop, Challenge, and Choose. And what the concept of that is we have, I think it's referred to in our trainings and whatnot. We've got our lizard brain, which is our reactionary emotional way of responding to situations, which is what we're basically talking about with, vices and, triggers and things like that. There's that emotional response, but the stop, challenge, and choose that challenge is where you just posed the question, where we shift out of that reactionary lizard brain response
right?
into a conscious, a bit questioning ourselves so that we can shift into the conscious side of our brain and make a decision based on rational conscious thought rather than the emotional trigger, the emotional response of eating the thing or drinking the drink or smoking the cigarette or whatever. But I love the way you just said, asking a question, what else could I do right now that would soothe this? And that's one of the things I remember. I even wrote this down when you talked about vices. There was a thing a piece in there where it says, what role do the vice play? What are those vices attached to and what do they soothe? And
Right.
so in that moment, what could I do right now to soothe the feeling I'm having other than the Chips Ahoy, other
Yeah.
than the beer, other whatever it might be? What else could I? And I love the way you just shifted the thought process into conscious, rational thinking rather than emotional responses and just running with the emotions and letting them control us.
Yeah, because I'm like, it's not about going back and saying, okay, well, now I got to run 5 miles on the treadmill because I ate a sleeve of cookies. It's about saying, how do I stop myself when I'm on the second cookie? Right? I mean, it would be ideal to stop yourself before you even opened them. But imagine if you got two in and you were like, okay, hang on a second. Do I need the whole sleeve? Can I have a conversation with myself right now and say, I can eat one. And when I figure out the answer to my question, I can eat the second one. I'm going to put the sleeve away.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm like, it's not about banishing food and it's not about beating ourselves up. It's about saying, how did I get here? And how do I stop myself from continually coming to this island or to this, right? And so I feel like two things, and we didn't talk about it yet, was like, I always talk about anchors and triggers. Like, the reason why we respond to things in the world is because there's an anchor on our map, right? The reason why these triggers can be set off is because there's a pre-existing, imagine it's like a pre-existing condition on our map. And or you can think about it. I think a lot of times people say, he's pushing my buttons or she's pushing my buttons. And I always say, well, what would happen if the button wasn't there? Like,
Mm.
the button's yours. So if you remove the button, you spend more time figuring out, how the hell did this button get on my map? And how do I dismantle it so that I can be free to move in my world And those things don't phase me anymore because the button's not there. Those triggers don't set me off anymore because I've released the anchor. And so until we understand why we have the pattern, it's really hard to change the pattern or to shift it or all the things, right? It's easier to just dive in and say, where did this habit come from? What am I actually trying to soothe right now? And it's really fascinating when you start to ask yourself questions like that. The default answer is, I have no idea, or I don't know, or what do you, I don't like, we're so far disconnected from it. But the more times you ask and the more times you ask, your unconscious mind will eventually give you some clues. And it might lead you to either you're going to play this movie in your head and go, oh my God, it's from when I was 6 and this thing happened. Or all of a sudden you're going to go, oh my God, and you're going to have a vivid, like recalled memory and say, oh my God, it's from 4th grade when my teacher told me I was bad at math, or it was like whatever it is, right? We have these beliefs, and the beliefs are what are cycling around in us that are attached to that root thing. But these beliefs are what keep all these things in line. This is what keeps us being an emotional eater or being a stressful eater or being like needing to go smoke or to go whatever it is, right? And I always say, there's no judgment here. I get it. We all have vices. It's just saying, how do I adopt a healthier vice while I try and figure out how to release this anchor or figure out how to put my finger on where this pattern started?
Mm-hmm. I have my own vice I have developed. I used to have the vice of overeating and unhealthy dietary practices, but now I have my vice is exercise.
Yeah.
Anytime I feel just stressed or my go-to is all right, go for a run, go for a bike ride, go to the gym, whatever. But all right, so I think we're at a point now since you just talked about asking yourself the question, where did this come up? And we've talked about the map. So the $1,000,000 question, the most important part of this thing is, okay, so Jodee, I asked myself a question the other day. When did I first use food as a way of soothing an emotional response or emotional situation? I found this anchor on my map. I know when it happened. Now what? Now, if I can change my map, if my map is editable, how do I edit my map so that I can get past? I mean, here it is, healing. Where
Yeah.
does the healing? How do we get healing and move forward past that stuff?
I love your question. Yes, absolutely. And this is where my brain goes. And this is something I'm currently working on, and I'll share it with you guys because I think it's really powerful. I think that you identify whoever you were in that moment. And so I share that and say, I have these conversations on a daily basis with clients, and I'll say to them, how old were you when the first time this pattern ran? How old were you the first time you remember feeling this way? And their answers are usually, there's this 2-minute pause. And then they'll say, I was 4. I remember, and they run through it, or they'll say, I was 9 and this is what happened. And I'm like, okay, if say that you were 9 years old when it happened. And then my next question is, where did you used to feel the most safe when you were 9? And so people will say things like, I would hide under my bed. I would go in the backyard on the swing set. I would go to my grandma's house. I would go for a bike, whatever they say, right? It's like, and then my next thing I say to them is, can you give that 9-year-old version of you a nickname? Right? So say that your nickname was, my name is Jodee. My nickname might have been JoJo, right? And so I literally say, can you invite right now that part of yourself to go to, say it's the backyard on the swing. Can you invite JoJo to go have a conversation with you on the back of the swing? And not that you physically have to go in your backyard, but you could sit down, eyes open or closed, and have a conversation with your 9-year-old self and say, hey, I know this was big and scary for you. Share with me what you needed in that moment. And it might sound crazy right now to say, wait, you want me to have a conversation with myself? Yes. I want you to have a conversation with that part of you. Because until that part of you feels whole, there's no way it can integrate into your current self, right? Until that part of your map isn't inflamed and on fire, like as long as that part of your map is either this cavernous hole, every time you pass through it, you're going to fall into it. So until you heal that space and be like, no, I can hit stress and I'm good. I know what to do. Or I can hit whatever. So the answer is going back and having a conversation with that version of you. Go back and have a heart to heart, a one-on-one. It, depending on how young you were, is dependent on how much information you'll get. And I know this sounds really crazy right now, but I'm encouraging you guys to go do it, because when you go do it, you're going to be like, oh my God, that was so crazy. Like you don't realize the answers that are going to surface from that little part of you.
Yeah.
And that little part of you is clearly still alive and well if it can answer the questions. And so what often happens is that little part of you, say that you were 4 and you healed this capacity, it might then graduate you and you find this other place where you were kind of snagged when you were 8 or 9. And then you heal that place and it now you're like, okay, I just found this other thing that hooked me up when I was, and this might happen over a month or 2, right? But then when you're having these big emotional responses, now you're having them instead of as a 4-year-old, now you're having them as a 9-year-old or as a 13-year-old. And you're just maturing that emotional response that was kind of frozen in time. I feel like I can share one more concept in like a minute or 2 that would really open people's brains.
Do it.
Way back in the day in the 1950s, there was a medical diagnosis, if you will, a mental illness diagnosis called arrested emotional development. And so the concept of it was, say that stress hit you when you were 4 years, you witnessed something when you were 4. Say that you were supposed to, let's use 5. Say that you're supposed to, your parent was going to pick you up from kindergarten, and you're sitting there as a 5-year-old, trusting that your parent's going to come get you. And for some odd reason, they forget. And this is what I'm talking about when we talk about trauma. It doesn't have to be big. Your parent forgets you. So you're either sitting outside, you're like, holy shit, where's my parent? Like, what is, right? And they forget you. So either you're left outside the school, or somebody from the school comes outside and comes in to get you and says, hey, let's call a parent. And your parent gets there and they're like, oh my gosh, I told whatever happened, right? But that's forever embedded on your map. And now, present day, every time you try to trust somebody, you're like, I don't know. It's because that traumatic moment was never processed. And now every time you lean in to use the emotion trust, what comes forward is that 5-year-old response. This is why you can see people in public and people around us have a full-on childlike meltdown, even though they're an adult. Because that emotion, whatever emotion was just triggered for them, is anchored on their map in the age that it was frozen, in the age that it was paralyzed, if you will. And so until we process these things on our map, we're going to keep having these really, I don't want to say inappropriate, because I feel like that feels like judgment. We're going to keep having these emotional dances, these emotional experiences that don't match our age.
Would immature be a better word?
Yeah, immature would sound good. Yeah. And it's just that part where either we judge ourselves or we find ourselves judging other people. And it's like, nobody wants to act like that. They just don't have the skill to process what's happening for them. They don't have access to, say that it's fear, abandonment, betrayal, whatever it is. They don't have access to that emotion like you or I do. And I sure we all have these, right? I'm not saying my map is 1,000% right. Like we've all lived through life with all these, and you can also call them micro traumas, but like trauma doesn't have to be like when my parents got divorced, or whatever. That doesn't have to be something big. It can be these little tiny things that was just really impactful for you. And your solution to that was whatever. But say that you go home that day and your parent is like, well, I didn't mean to leave you. Why were you crying? Now the teacher thinks I'm a jerk. And the parent is now shouting at you. And you're the one that got left. You're 5 years old. You only have the emotional capacity of a 5-year-old. And they're just berating you. And they don't mean to, right? They don't have enough emotional intelligence to know how to not do that. And so they're just exacerbating this. And then we find a way to cope and soothe. we go into survival mode. So imagine that's how these things are built. That's how coping mechanisms either don't happen, or how addictions and I should say that's how appropriate coping skills don't develop, and instead we create something in its place. But that's how really this all starts. And it's all, I want to say it all starts really innocently. Like, I don't think our parents ever meant to do us harm. They just didn't have the capacity to know exactly what we needed, right? I always say, like, we don't know what we don't know. And once we do, we operate differently.
Yeah, I think I remember a portion of your book. I might be thinking of a different book, but I feel like I remember there being a part of your book where you talked about, you know what, everybody's doing the best they can,
Yeah.
but we all make so many mistakes, but it's not like anybody's intentionally trying to traumatize their child or have these incidences on their map that wind up hurting them 20, 30, 40 years down the road and keeping them arrested. You talked about the arrested development.
Yeah.
Um, we're all doing the best we can. I know there's plenty of times as a parent that I look back and I just think, man, I wish I would have been better here. Man, I wish I would have never said that. Wow, I wish I would have never done that. I wish I'd never made my kid feel that. Um, but it's just
Yeah.
doing our best.
Well, I'm just going to circle back and say two things. I feel like I've had the luxury of having two kids that are 17 years apart. And I feel like it was an honor because I always say, like, I think I completely screwed up my older daughter. However, we have this amazing bond because we grew up together. I was a teen mom. Like, that's my story. And so my little daughter is now, my older daughter's 30, my little daughter's 13. And so I feel like I'm learning so much more by having this gift of being able to do this again. And what I can share is the greatest thing that we can do for ourselves in those moments is just have grace and compassion. And even if there's times where I'll say to my older daughter, I apologize. I never taught you that skill. Like, she'll get really frustrated or mad about something, and I'll say, listen, I'm really sorry. I didn't have access to that skill then, but if it's helpful right now, I can tell you what I've learned since I taught you that. Or I
Hmm.
can tell you how I would do this now if it's helpful, right? And I think the greatest thing that we can be is transparent and vulnerable and say, parenting doesn't come with a manual. So none of us know what we're doing. Even now with my 13-year-old, sometimes I'm like, do people realize, like, I'm the person in charge? Like, I don't think I should be in charge here. Right. In a funny way, but it's just about understanding. Like, sometimes I'm like, is there an adult here? But it's that candid way of just really allowing your kids to grow and thrive by seeing you be vulnerable, or seeing you be transparent, or by them seeing you have emotions. Imagine how different our lives would be if we watched our parents express emotions, and if somebody held space for us to process emotions. It's really what this is all about. And so instead of housing or instead of processing and experiencing the emotion, we just contain them, and we embody them, and we shove them down, or we mask them, right? And so it's about understanding, like, there's times I'll say to both my kids, I have no idea what I'm doing, or this really sucks. I don't have an answer right now. Like, what do you guys need? Like, I don't even, like, how can I support you through this? What do you, right? And it's just about being really real. And I think what that teaches them is, A, their mom doesn't have all the answers. And B, there's going to be times in life where it's okay to not know. It's okay to not have answers. It's okay to say, can I just catch my breath? Can I get some support around here? I think that's the other thing too, is we've been taught to be so self-reliant and fiercely independent. Like, fierce independence is a trauma response. Like, if you have to do it yourself and you're not going to take any help, and that's a trauma response. You learned at a really young age that you had to take care of you and that no one was coming to help you. I think that's huge for us, Generation Xers, as, like, we're figure it outers, if you
Yeah,
will.
for sure.
But what we realize is sometimes we expect our kids to figure it out, instead of saying, let me stand in the gap. Let me be the person who wasn't there for me. Or let me be a little bit more transparent, versus being the parent that's like, because I said so. Right. And kind of walking them down. Well, you can make that decision, but here's the consequence that follows. And I think that's what's missing in humanity right now, is just letting people be whoever they are, wherever they are, instead of expecting them to be who we need them to be.
Hmm. Wow, that's deep. That's a whole nother podcast. That's a whole
Right?
nother topic. Well, we're not going to solve all the world's emotional eating and stress eating in this one podcast, but at the very least, what I was hoping to accomplish with this is to basic to show people that there is an answer to fixing the things that they're struggling with, and it's not going to work if you just try to do it through sheer willpower. It's
Right.
just not. It's not going to work if you just try to be self-disciplined. These are things that will work temporarily, but they're not, and it's just like the medication we talked about earlier. It's not fixing the real root of the
Right.
problem. There's a portion of your book, and I'll just read this, and then we're going to bring the plane down. But there's a portion of your book on page number 102. I wrote this down, and I think this is really important for us to understand this, but also understand it, realizing now that we can change our map and we can change who we are. But it says the more you run a pattern, the more fluent the neural pathway becomes. The more fluent the pathway, the more it runs on default. Eventually, the response becomes who you are.
Yeah.
And we have people around the world in the diet world trying to lose weight through willpower and self-discipline and following structured programs and checking all the boxes. And they're running around with issues on their maps or running around with anchors on their maps. And no matter what program they do, no matter what diet they do, no matter what shot they take, no matter what pill they pop, no matter what they try to do to get themselves healthy, until they get those anchors and rip those anchors out and heal their map, it's just going to be this vicious cycle of yo-yo dieting, never being able to stick with anything long enough to see long-term, real lasting success. And so just bringing awareness to the fact that, number one, we have to change, we have to yank those anchors out, but it's doable. And that to me is
Yeah.
like the hope that gives me, if I'm on the other side of this podcast, knowing I'm an emotional eater, I'm a stress eater, I have food addictions, knowing that, oh my God, I can actually heal the root cause of this, and I don't have to struggle with this anymore. And even if I do struggle
Right.
with it, I have a mechanism to cope with it, and I'm not responding to every event like a 5-year-old child. I can now cope with this as an adult and make rational, logical decisions. Just knowing that this is possible to me is like a game changer. If I was on the other side of
Yeah.
this and struggling with those things, just knowing, oh, I never knew I could be fixed. In fact, I would say that there's probably people listening to this that never even realized that there was a root problem in the first place. If it
Right.
happened to you when you were 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, you don't
It's
consciously
who
know
you
that.
are.
It's who
Yeah.
you are. It's just embedded in your programming. But the beauty of it is, if you'll ask your brain, hey, brain, when did this get programmed into me? When did this event, what happened to me, and when did it happen to make me become the person that I am? It's amazing how that information is in there. And if you'll be patient and ask the question, the information will come out like a Google search.
Exactly. I was just going to say that. And I too wanted to share this before we close, and just sharing, if you ask yourself, like, and I know that we were using the word like emotional eater or stress eater, like in my brain, I'm like, what does stress mean? And so when you say to yourself, what am I feeling right now? And people are going, oh, I feel stressed. I feel anxious. Okay, slow down and go deeper. Do I feel betrayed? Do I feel hurt? Do I feel sad? Do I feel beat up? Do I feel abandoned? Am I frustrated? Am I outraged? Like, what am I actually feeling? And when you can get down to the feeling and you're like, okay, I feel threatened. I feel angry, or I feel like, get to the feeling and then say, okay, yeah, that. Where did that start? And people are like, oh, and usually people go, they immediately sit back and they're like, And that's where the silence comes. And it takes them a good minute or two, maybe longer. It could be a week from now, it surfaces for them. But
Yeah.
the way to awaken your map and the way to ask questions and to find out what's happening, the way to find out what's happening in your unconscious mind is to ask questions. And so you can say, hey, how do I know that this is true? Where does this live in my physiology? How old was I when it arrived? Who else was involved? Where was I, or where, like, there's so many, and I think it's page 134 in the book is the list of 5 questions that I always lead people to, that if you ask these 5 questions, they pull forward content like never before. I think a lot of times the question we spend too much time asking ourselves why, like, why isn't this working? Why, versus saying how, what, who, where, and when. And those 5 questions pull forward 5 different layers of answers. So you could ask yourself the same question, prefacing it with these 5 different words, and get a whole bunch of content you've never had access to before.
Mm. So for the person that's listening to this right now, that's thinking, man, this is lighting me up. I can see where this would be extremely valuable to me, but it sounds it's too big for me to do by myself. I know this is something that you help people with as an NLP
Absolutely.
coach. I know this is something that you could take somebody down through this journey and help them to recover and heal. So tell our listeners, where can they find you? How can they reach you? Give us your social media, all the things.
Absolutely. So all of my social media is the same. It's Jodee Gibson, and Jodee is Jodee Gibson. You can also Google Jodee Gibson and find, as long as you put the 2 E's on there, Jodee. You can jump on my website, which is jodeegibson.com. I'm all over social media. I often teach like courses, and or I'm looking into doing events soon. I speak a lot all over the world in different places, in different genres of people, just trying to help people become, I want to say, more fluent with what's possible, and then we can dive into how to do it. And so I feel like when I'm speaking, it's more about kind of like this, just educating people, and then we can dive deeper. I do have minimal spots for one-on-one clients. I do more of the group work stuff, but I'm available on any social media channel. Jump into my DMs, email me, jump on my website. Really super easy to connect with me.
Awesome. Well, folks, just as a quick review, I guess this is just the school teacher in me. I'm always doing like, okay, let's scan through and just hit the high points. Everybody has a map. No two maps have ever been the same in the history of mankind. Your map is different than every map that has ever been. There are places on all of our maps that are anchors. There are places on our maps that cause us to get triggered in certain situations that are connected to events that happened probably before we even consciously can even think about it. But the things that we're struggling with now, especially in these emotional, stressful type situations, especially when it comes to diet and eating and health, there are roots in our map. There are anchors in our map that if we'll take the time to try to find those, we can yank those anchors out. We can heal those roots, and we can move forward and stop having to struggle with the vices that we're currently using to be able to soothe every situation that our neurology tells us, okay, this is the fix. This is the fix. This is the fix. This will soothe. We can fix that stuff and end the struggling. And Jodee's the kind of person that can help you do that. So if any of this hits home with you, reach out to her, find her through her social media, find her through her website, go out and get the book, Healing Your Map. It's on Amazon. It's not expensive, maybe $20, might be the best $20 you've ever spent, because it will definitely help you navigate. And if you don't want to go through and call Jodee and talk to her personally, this book is a how-to. The whole book is,
Absolutely.
okay, stop and take notes right here. Ask yourself these questions and write down what comes to you. The entire book is a how-to, step by step. It walks you through this journey and so much more. So go out and get Healing Your Map. Jodee, I am excited. if one person hears this podcast and it opens up a whole new realm of understanding for them and it can change their life in a positive way in the world of health and fitness and wellness, then that's a win for me. And that's why I do this. So I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to share your brilliance and your understanding of this with our listeners, because I just know deep down somebody's listening to this today that's thinking, man, that's a game changer for me. I never knew any of that, and I'm going to run with it. Well, run with this. My throat got a little cracked up there, but I'm just going to run with it and I'm going to fix it. And this is all because of what you were willing to do today. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you for letting me jam. I'm with you. I'm like, if it changes one person's life, it's worth it.
Yeah, I feel
I
like
just
it
always
will.
say too, like, yeah, I always close with the idea too of it doesn't matter where you started. Like, what matters is what you're willing to learn in order to heal.
Boom. That's a mic drop. Nothing else left to say. All right, Jodee, thank you so much. And everybody, thank you for listening to the Fit Factor today. I hope this was valuable to you. It was valuable for me. But see you on the next episode. We're out.